From Lagos, the nation's commercial capital, this is the news at 10, live from Channels Television. Reporting tonight,
Ijoma Oyato.
Hello and welcome. Tonight, about 150 Egyptians die in bloody clashes after security forces move in to clear out pro-Morsi protesters from camps. State of emergency declared in Egypt. American government condemns killings, describes it as deplorable. Nigeria's military insists it's winning the war against insurgents in the northeast. And Bakassi returnees cry out for help, demand permanent homes to keep ancestral legacies.
On Business News tonight, the Securities and Exchange Commission introduces a new issue rule to deepen the capital market.
And on sports news tonight, African champions Nigeria Super Eagles confirm superiority over Bafana Bafana, beat the South Africans to win the Mandela Challenge.
We start off tonight in North Africa, Egypt, where events took a violent turn today, leaving hundreds dead. While reports say about 500 people were killed, the Muslim Brotherhood says that figure is over 2,000. Following these bloody clashes, a state of emergency has been declared in the country, leaving Egyptians to face a month of restricted movement and activities. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Amarachi Ubani reports.
Defiant supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi burnt tires after police swiftly cleared out their protest camp in Al-Anada near Cairo University this morning. Army vehicles and soldiers had blocked the entrance to the camp. The supporters have been staging a sit-in for the last 6 weeks, calling for Morsi's reinstatement. Residents of the area stood in their balconies and watched as tear gas filled the air and a helicopter was seen hovering over the scene. Army soldiers and vehicles blocked entrances to the camp and riot police would be present. Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood said Egyptian security forces killed at least 30 people today when they cleared the larger camp in Rabaa al-Adawiyah in northeast Cairo. There was no official confirmation of the death at Rabaa al-Adawiyah, where thousands of Morsi supporters were the police helicopters circling over the site. With the Brotherhood calling on supporters to take to the streets, the violence risks further destabilizing the most populous Arab nation and endangering hopes for democracy.
Now we're going to give you more perspective on today's developments in Egypt. I'm now being joined via Skype by senior foreign correspondent, Channel 4 News, Jonathan Rogman. He's in Cairo right now. So, Jonathan, we know a state of emergency has been declared, and what can you see right now?
Well, Cairo is extremely quiet. The drive-in from the airport to the centre of the city was almost deserted, and if you know how crazily busy Cairo can be with its something like 19 million people, you'll know what a surprise that is. People are keeping behind their doors, keeping themselves to themselves, and effectively martial law has been declared because there is, as you say, a month-long state of emergency as well as an evening curfew here in Cairo. And the health ministry is now saying that 235 civilians were killed today, along with over 2,000 wounded. The Muslim Brotherhood says those figures are in fact much, much higher. But whatever the truth, this is clearly the most violent single day Egypt has seen in decades.
Well, indeed, there is that curfew right now. Can journalists like yourself work and move around, or is it an all-out crackdown like we see? What's it like for you?
So I missed your question. I think you said, what is it like here?
Yes, my question is about the curfew. Is it an all-out crackdown? Can journalists like yourself move around, or is everybody going to have to be holed up?
Well, I just walked across Tahrir Square to get to this position where I am now. There were armoured personnel carriers on the streets and at major junctions. I think Tahrir Square, of course, having been the scene of protests on June the 30th, which in fact encouraged and indeed led to the army moving in and toppling President Morsi, that's a pretty safe place to be. But I would not want to go any further than Tahrir Square at this time of night, especially not after a colleague of mine, a Sky News cameraman, was shot and killed earlier today, and another colleague of mine who works for Channel 4 News was beaten up by plainclothes thugs presumed to be working for the state authorities. Cameras are being confiscated at Cairo's international airport, and there's a real sense that the authorities here do not want the events here being covered.
Okay, what about emergency services? Are there anything like that available? We know there are indeed many people injured. Have you seen anything like that at the moment? That's in terms of emergency services, people coming in to try and see to the injured.
Well, you have to remember that the violence started in the early hours of this morning, about 7 o'clock in the morning. So it's pretty much over by now in the two camps that the Muslim Brotherhood had, where it had thousands of supporters on the streets of Cairo. I did see 6 ambulances this evening heading towards the Rabaa Al Adawiya Mosque, which is where most of the protesters were based. I think the question is now, what is the Muslim Brotherhood going to do? Is it going to carry on protesting, or is it going to take the message from the security forces, which is that they will not tolerate protests and they will shoot to kill, which is what we saw happen today?
I was going to ask you about that because we did hear that key members of the Muslim Brotherhood were arrested. Is there any word on that? A lot of arrests have been happening up to today, but we did hear that some key members were arrested. What can you tell us about that?
My understanding is that there were several arrests today of Muslim Brotherhood leaders. One of them, Mohammed El-Beltaghi, who is the Secretary General of the Muslim Brotherhood's political party. His 17-year-old daughter was killed today in these protests. And of course, President Morsi himself, who was ousted, has not been seen for the last 6 weeks and is being held in detention somewhere. It feels very much as if Egypt has gone back to the Mubarak era. It feels as if this is once again a police state. And the strange thing about it is that a lot of Egyptians would say they agree with that, and they believe that the army and the police were right to move in. They may not say it publicly, but a lot of Egyptians feel that the Muslim Brotherhood was bad for Egypt, and though they may regret the violence, they don't regret the fact that these protests may have been broken up.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your insight there. Do your best to try and stay safe in the light of the happenings today. I've been speaking with the senior foreign correspondent for Channel 4 News, Jonathan Rugman. He's in Cairo at the moment, as he's been giving us a feel of what's been happening in light of the current crackdown in Egypt on those protesters that were the pro-Morsi protesters, that is. Now, we're going to keep on with that, and there's been more international reaction where U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says the United States strongly condemns today's violence and bloodshed in Egypt, describing it as a serious blow to reconciliation efforts. At a briefing in Washington, D.C., Mr. Kerry urged Egypt's interim leaders to take a step back and calm the situation to avoid further deaths. He also said the U.S. strongly opposes a return to a state of emergency and that it should end as soon as possible. Also condemning today's violence is British Prime Minister David Cameron, who condoled with the family of the British cameraman Mick Dean, who was killed in the crackdown. He said that violence is not going to solve anything and that he does not support it. Adding his voice, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, also strongly condemned the violence. His message was conveyed by the deputy spokesman for the Secretary General, Mr. Eduardo Del Bui. He regretted that Egyptian authorities chose instead to use force to respond to the ongoing demonstrations.
Violence is simply not a solution in Egypt or anywhere else. Violence will not create a roadmap for Egypt's future. Violence only impedes the transition to an inclusive civilian government, a government chosen in free and fair elections that governs democratically consistent with the goals of the Egyptian revolution. And violence and continued political polarization will only further tear the Egyptian economy apart and prevent it from growing, providing the jobs in the future that the people of Egypt want so badly. The United States strongly supports the Egyptian people's hope for a prompt and sustainable transition to an inclusive, tolerant, civilian-led democracy.
The Secretary General regrets that Egyptian authorities chose instead to use force to respond to the ongoing demonstrations. While recognizing that political clocks do not run backwards, the Secretary General also believes firmly that violence and incitement from any side are not the answers to the challenges Egypt faces.